It's the Onstage Podcast with Chris Robert.
Hello.
Hello, good afternoon, Eric. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
I listen to a lot of I gotta tell you, your YouTube channel is excellent, and your YouTube podcast, Violinist podcast, excellent. I want to say something. I'm sorry, but I'm trying to find how your last name was pronounced. I might as well ask you. How do you?
It's okay. It's not common for English speakers. It's a Polish last name, so it's Mrugala.
I knew it. I was thinking Mrugala, but yeah, excellent.
No, it's not Mrugala like arugula the salad. I've gotten that many times, but it's Mrugala. Yeah.
Nice. So, how are you, my friend? So happy that you are now spending time with us on the podcast. Find out all about you, who you are, what makes you tick.
Yeah, thanks so much. First of all, thanks so much for having me. I think I think we're recording right now, but yeah, the YouTube channel started out as kind of like a pandemic project, and it was an outlet for me to get to my students for everyone who was at home. Of course, everybody was taking violin lessons at home because of the lockdowns, and I figured this would be like one extra resource for the parents, especially to help explain to their kids how I would usually explain things in class. So the great thing about YouTube, of course, is that the videos stay up for a very long time, if not forever, unless you physically take them down. So I leave all my videos up as a resource for all violinists around the world, so that way they can, get some practice tips and career advice. And that's kind of how I got started. And I've been enjoying the process.
Yeah, excellent. I really enjoy your violin podcast, and I noticed a lot of names that I've had on my podcast, and I'm thinking, wow, how can you do a whole podcast just inviting and interviewing violinists? And I'm like, I don't see James Ennis in there.
Not yet. Not yet. Actually, James Ennis, since we're on the topic, he's one of my all-time favorite violinists. He was, yeah, he was the one violinist that got me into the Korngold Violin Concerto. I remember very clearly, it was around 12 years ago where I first listened to the Korngold Violin Concerto. And for those of you who don't know who Erich Korngold was, he was an Austrian composer. And because of World War II, him and his family actually had to leave Austria, and he ended up in Hollywood and became a Hollywood composer. And his violin concerto was premiered by the great Jascha Heifetz, which I recommend listening to that recording on YouTube. It's out there somewhere. But for some reason, I came across James Ennis's version of the Korngold Violin Concerto, and I thought, wow, the colors that he's getting out of his Stradivari violin was just incredible. So yeah, he's been a fan of mine and I've been a fan of his, I should say, for a very long time.
I'm a big fan of James Ennis because I love his Partita 3, third, I think his third movement. And also I'm a big fan of Joshua Bell as well. And what do you think of Pinchas Zuckerman or Itzhak Perlman? What do you think of their playing?
Well, of course, they're like the legendary greats, like Pinchas Zuckerman and Itzhak Perlman. They were able to create so many legendary recordings. As a matter of fact, I was listening to a great recording with Pinchas Zuckerman and Isaac Stern with the E-flat major Mozart Divertimenti, and that is actually a fantastic recording of them. And you could also see them playing the Mozart Sinfonia Concertante, which is a very famous violin viola concerto for that particular arrangement, and as well as orchestra. And yeah, they're just, they are the classics. We always refer to those recordings as like the classic recording, just because of the nature of the recording industry back in the day. Everyone was finally given access to like really great recording and studios, and finally we were able to capture really high quality sounds. So that's why everyone back in the day, in like the 50s, 60s onwards, were able just to do like so many recordings because people were demanding it.
It says here that you were based in Boston, Massachusetts. Did you actually grow up in Boston as well?
I'm actually based in Boston now, but I actually grew up in Chicago, Illinois. That's where I was born and raised. And I actually went to Boston for school and stayed in Massachusetts since then.
Oh, that's it. You enjoy it there?
Yes, I really enjoy it there. I know my family and we are currently living in Massachusetts at the moment. What I love about New England in general is that there is such a vibrant music community, and for anyone who is listening to this podcast, who are not familiar with what I think about networking and everything, that is important to be in a region or in a profession where there is a lot of demand. And of course, there's a lot of supply for that demand in New England. So there's music everywhere. I'm able to perform many diverse genres. And that's something that I actually mentioned in my recent YouTube video, which I highly recommend, the 65 concerts that I did in 2 years. Of course, it would have been a lot more because of COVID, that kind of, brought a hiatus to the entire music industry. But for me, I love the fact that I'm able to have a variety of different genres to play. And that's what keeps my music career really going, and it's not boring for me.
Oh, that's good. Yeah. Regarding the 65 events the last 2 years, we'll have that link in the description of the video. So tell us about the type of violin that you have. Why is it so important to you? And I noticed that you've been talking about how to hold it, how to put it in your neck, and the tension strings. You seem so passionate. Can you tell us a little bit about more about your passion and whatever got you into it? And why the violin and not something like a piano or...
Of course, yeah. Well, let me bring you back to when I was 3 years old, and I actually did not choose the violin, believe it or not. My mother chose the violin for me, and she had a music education background. She was, going to college for music education, and then that's when both my parents immigrated to the United States, to Chicago. And she was like, she just threw a violin at me, and she was like, okay, you're playing the violin, and that's the end of it. And I'm like, okay. I didn't even bother like exploring other instruments. I never really had any interest in that. But I know that the violin brought me a lot of joy in my life, which which helped me pursue 2 degrees in violin. And during that time, after my bachelor's, I worked at a string shop, local string shop here in New England, and that really got me interested in product reviews. I feel like that was the first time where I was really interested in what kinds of strings people are playing. I started noticing, members of Boston Symphony Orchestra buying specific kinds of strings, and even like members from like a Far Cry, which is a very famous string ensemble based here in Boston as well. And I just started getting really curious about that. Just in my own personal sake, I didn't even think about starting a YouTube channel at that point in time because if you're not familiar, most classical musicians, they go from a bachelor's and they go straight into a master's, just because they don't want to lose, they're at the peak of their level and they want to make sure they can get into a master's program. I was actually the opposite. I was one of 3 people that did not go straight into a master's. And I talk about this because I think it's a very healthy break for people who are burnt out from school. And I know I certainly was. And that kind of helped me realize what the market really is. And I talk about that on my violin podcast, and I talk about that on the YouTube channel, that, I am a musician, but I'm also a business. And I also like to talk about that in great detail because it is an important factor. So that leads me to today, where I, host a violin podcast. I, also hosted like a kind of a side project called the Everyday Musician Podcast. And that's actually what led me to start the violin podcast because, for me, for the Everyday Musician, it was more so I'm just interviewing my friends, and it was all sorts of genres, different instruments and vocalists and whatnot. But then I really wanted to talk about the violin because that's something that I do every day. And I was thinking one day, I wonder if there's a violin podcast. And lo and behold, there was no such thing as a violin podcast. So I'm like, okay, I better get on this. So I bought the domain name, and I'm like, okay, now what? So how do I want this podcast to be? Is it just about me? Is it about talking to other musicians, other violinists? What is this podcast going to look like? And I actually ended up doing maybe a combination of both, where I do mention violin tips and tutorials, and actually leave that in the description of my podcast episodes. But most importantly, I want the guests, the people I'm interviewing, to really bring knowledge and use the Violin podcast as a resource from like industry professionals. So that's how I got to this point. And I'm also grateful for my mentors, my teachers, and my colleagues for getting me here today.
So, is there anything about the violinists that you have on your podcast? What do they bring to the table? Anything new? Anything that helps you in your passion?
Yeah, I learned a lot through my guests, and this is actually kind of like a research project for me. I actually think of this as like my doctorate in some way, because not only am I doing something that I'm passionate about, but I'm talking to industry professionals to see what's actually relevant in the market today. Market meaning, how are other teachers teaching their students? What are violinists doing today that help them get to where they were in their careers? How do they prepare for competitions? And all that information that I gather really helps me in my own lessons that I teach my students, because I have a direct link to the person I just interviewed. It's like, oh, I just talked to this person the other day, and this is how it's relevant to our situation here in the lesson. And of course, I can't say that to all students. Some students are more mature and they're older, so I can, make it more relevant. But I also invite the parents to listen to the podcast, because it also gives them a basic idea of like what they're getting their children into when they have lessons with me. So for me, but to answer your question, do they bring anything new to the table? I would say they don't bring anything surprisingly new, but I feel like the outlet, the way we do things is different now. With social media being such a prominent thing in our lives, we're having a podcast interview through the internet, through this medium. I think this is just such an amazing opportunity for musicians. I think you're starting to see more entrepreneurism, and you're starting to see a lot of more classical musicians, especially in my field, taking action for their own destiny. I think that is the biggest goal. People are, working hard and doing that. But it's not a new idea, Chris, because Mozart did it hundreds of years ago. Mozart was responsible for creating a concert series, composing the music, hiring the musicians, selling the tickets, making sure that their patrons are happy. This is not a new idea. I feel like the medium in which we do it has changed and is continuing to evolve.
So do you have any violinists that actually reach out to you and say, I want to be on your podcast, I have something new to bring, or I have a desire to be interviewed, or do you have to reach out to them?
I feel like it's I would say maybe it's like 30-70, like 30% of violinists that I can think of maybe in previous seasons have reached out to me. And some of them I do accept them on my violin podcast. Sometimes I say, right now is not the right time, and I'll reach out to you in a later time. But most of the time, I am the one reaching out to guests.
Because I noticed that when I reach out to musicians, or whichever you're playing, a pianist or whatever, it takes them so long to respond.
It does happen, yeah. I would say that's why I'm actually grateful to have the podcast release like every 2 weeks, because if I remember doing the first season, I believe maybe once a week, and that really burned me out. And even though that was really healthy for the podcast, I also have to make sure I'm healthy and emotionally and like mentally stable, because there is such a thing as burnout, especially with all the projects that I have on the side. It's really healthy for me to have that balance, and I know that I can create the content that I want with a high quality. It may be a little bit less output in terms of the episodes, but I know that I'm having a quality interview. I'm not rushing guests, and I feel like that was really important for me when I decided to go bi-weekly.
I'm thinking maybe I should stick just 2 weeks, because mental health is important, and I'm totally booked with guests, and sometimes I don't know what to do. But that's a wonderful niche that you discovered, a violin podcast. Why not? And who is more professional to handle this is a violinist themselves. We really like your YouTube channels, and we really love everything you do. Like, for instance, Filament Strings 5 Days Later. You talk about the 6 metronome hacks for musicians, and also the release neck tension on the violin. I've asked many violinists about how do they do that, and you seem to be the only one that actually talks about that. Is there a
Oh,
proper
thank you.
way? Is there a proper way to have the violin on your neck, and a bad way to have it on your neck?
Well, I wouldn't say there's a bad way nor there's a good way. I feel like there are so many schools of violin these days that for me, I don't care how you do it as long as you don't get injured doing it. Some people have tension in their neck and they seem to be perfectly fine with having that tension in their neck. I know for me, I suffered, a nerve injury on my left hand. So for those of you like, what the heck is a nerve injury on a violin? So imagine that you get your feet asleep. You like to feel the needles in like your feet, right? When there's not enough blood circulation going into your foot. Well, I was having that sensation in my left hand whenever I was playing the violin, and it actually hurt a lot. And it wasn't until I reached college that I fixed my setup. So I was stubborn. Imagine like a 17-year-old senior in high school trying to experiment with different shoulder heights and chin rest heights. And for me, I did get injured, and my professor, who I'm really grateful for, has helped me kind of readjust how I actually supposed to play the violin. And it's not about holding tension, but it's always about releasing that tension. Because if I were to tell a violinist, to play while they're relaxed for 100% of the time, well, that's just simply not true in my experience. There will be some sort of tension, but it's learning how to release the tension in the appropriate time in your music. So it's all about context as well. And for me, the way I like to hold the violin is on the collarbone. So I have a little bit of wood on the back of the violin touching my collarbone. So that way, I think with the collarbone as like a chair, and the violin simply sits on the chair, and then the shoulder rest, if you do choose to play with the shoulder rest, lays down right below the collarbone, but still on your upper chest. And for me is a very snug fit, and I have the most comfort. And that's something that I really emphasize with all my students, because I do have colleagues who have had injuries and are not the same violinists as they were back in their collegiate days. So I don't try to scare my students, but I just try to tell them the realities, because oftentimes parents are not informed of these cases. So, they're practicing. But if you practice one way a certain amount of times, then you actually can master your mistakes. So that's what I like to emphasize with my YouTube videos and my students when I do private lessons.
Yeah, because I notice and observe a lot of violinists, and their neck is like this. And imagine having to do that for a full blown show, like an hour and a half. You're just like this. You're going to end up going like, okay, guys, time for a break, And
Right. Yeah.
but I like that seat. You can buy those separately, I heard, and there's different types. So how would you? I guess you manage to find the right seat is to put on the violin and test it out, and then remove it and put on. Is that how it works? Or do
Well,
you also?
everyone, like I say, everyone has a different school of thought when it comes to shoulder rest. I know many violinists, and actually a lot of successful violinists, who choose to opt out of the shoulder rest. And, and that's all power to them. Actually, a lot of professional soloists around the world do play without a shoulder rest. I'm just talking based from my experience. And it's all like a case by case basis with students that I've noticed that some students just simply have a longer neck, and I would simply suggest a different kind or a different brand of shoulder rest. Or, a student may have a shorter neck, and maybe a shoulder rest may not be the best fit. So maybe like with beginners, I might encourage like a foam, that helps keep the violin stable and uplifted, and, not have that much fatigue while they play. So it really is a case by case basis. And the shoulder rest, of course, you can purchase separately. You don't want to drill in shoulder rest in your violin. Of course, that's like sacrilege. I would not recommend that. But you are given so many options. Everybody has, like, going back to the whole age of entrepreneurism, everybody's starting to create products that feel like they are good to help, release shoulder tension, shoulder, all sorts of shoulder problems. So it all depends, and you have to just experiment for a little bit to get the right fit.
Well, talking about entrepreneurship, is there anything that you could add to a violin to make it more of an invention? Like, for instance, a violin that actually has the shoulder rest built in, Like for instance, there are iPhone cases that actually have um, like a little stand you pull out and you can literally watch things, but it's part of the stand. Could you buy a violin like that where it actually has a pull out? Like what could be invented to make the violin more different, or that you'll have
Well,
to purchase separately?
it's it's pretty common practice to buy a shoulder rest separately. I think what tends to happen is we try to we try to fix what's not broken, and the model that Stradivari and Guarneri and Amati, Viome, those people have perfected the violin model,
Mm.
hundreds of years ago. And there are of course luthiers who try to push the design and maybe do like a different color, or many luthiers are known for having copies of these famous instruments. So in terms of the actual invention, uh, I'm sure there is something out there in terms of like having some kind of combination of violin shoulder rest. But I know I've interviewed someone on the violin podcast who was using 3D technology to create violins and instruments to make it more accessible and more affordable for school districts who don't have a big budget but want music education in their curriculum. So I know that there is like carbon fiber violins, Lewis and Clark, based in Massachusetts, they have carbon fiber instruments. And, this guest from Cleveland, Ohio, who is the inventor and creator of 3D music. So there are people trying to push the boundaries, but people always refer back to these master designs by Stradivari, Guarneri, etc.
Yeah, I've seen violins that are different sizes. You have the large violins, you have the viola, and then you have the smaller one. I saw a video on YouTube where the person actually plays every single one of those violins. The point they play the smaller one, and it has more of a higher sound to it.
Yeah.
Like for the violin that you play, do you have a certain sound that you prefer, or you just like the fact that I can play the violin, so I'll play one of those electric ones?
Well, of course, because I've been playing the violin for so long, I'm able to understand and hear the subtleties with each sound. And that comes with practice, and that comes with having a trained ear. So something that I may hear, someone else may not be able to hear. So generally speaking, I like to, play on medium tension strings because that allows me a little bit more flexibility in the sound. And each string brand has different qualities to it. So there, you could purchase strings that are high tension, you can purchase strings that are low tension and medium tension. And what that does is the contact point and the amount of weight and pressure that you apply to the strings is quite different than other strings. For instance, like for me personally, I don't play on high tension strings, but medium tension is like a good happy medium for me because I'm able to do what I want to do. And within that medium tension string categories, there are also many brands who are trying to create strings with a sound that they believe will help musicians out.
So, do you take care of your own violin on your own, or do you actually take it in, like, for instance, a rosin? You use a rosin on your own? Do you change the strings on your own? Do you have it repaired on your own, or do you have to take it into a professional?
For strings, I do it on my own. That's something that you save a couple of bucks and save time going into a shop. That's something that you just learn how to do over time. Rosin the bow, of course, that takes 5 seconds every time you take the violin out or take the bow out. In terms of bow rehairs, I definitely don't do that. I leave that up to a luthier because once you start purchasing equipment and expensive equipment, you don't really want to break or mess something up because sometimes the repairs can cost more than the equipment itself, believe it or not. So you want to be really careful with how you manage and how you take care of your equipment. Right now we're approaching the fall season, so I may have a humidifier running so that my violin stays more happy, so that the transition to colder weather will be a smoother transition. We definitely don't want musicians experiencing fatalities with their instrument going from a very hot climate to a very cold climate. And that's an occupational hazard actually, because you have a lot of musicians, soloists for instance, who actually play only in winter continents for a given period of time, because they don't want their violin to be you know, going crazy or going berserk for them on stage. So, but to answer your overall question, yes, I do take care of my instrument to a certain extent, but if there's like a chip, God forbid, or if I need to make a sound post adjustment, I go to a professional, and I recommend people listening to this podcast who is a violinist to go to your local luthier and get a professional opinion.
So that violin that you play, it's not one that was specifically customized for you, and it wasn't certainly the one that your mother gave you. What type of violin do you have, and how many violins do you own, and which one do you like using?
Great question. So right now I have the unique pleasure of playing on a Douglas Cox violin, which is a violin maker based in Brattleboro, Vermont. And he has generously loaned me the instrument for a few years as an artist agreement. And what was great about that violin is that it has so many colors. It's really great to have to be able to play in chamber music because it has so many colors. The versatility of that instrument is great. But it does have its drawbacks. Like, it is quite a booming instrument. It is quite resonant and quite loud. So to be able to play that kind of violin in an orchestral setting may not be ideal. So sometimes I like to refer to my other violin, which is the violin that I own, is a Jan Pawlikowski, which was made in 2015 in Krakow, Poland. And that's a great violin. That's something that I have a great attachment towards with that instrument. We've been through many concerts together, some ups, some downs. And that's the wonderful thing about looking at your instrument and looking at where you are right now as a musician, and even in your personal life. Like, this instrument has been with me for quite some time now. And it's just a pleasure to be able to play on like extraordinary works of art like that.
Am I under the impression that the type of wood the violin is made gives it a certain sound? Like, you don't want to say it's all the same because you were talking about carbon fiber. Would you say that all violins sound the same, except for the size of them? Like I mentioned, little tiny ones, and the cello, of course, and the violist. But am I under the impression am I under the impression that the type of wood the violin is made out of has something to do with the way it sounds?
Yes, I think it would say. Of course, I'm not a luthier, so I wouldn't be able to tell you any specifics, of course. But a violin is made of various woods. The fingerboard is made of ebony. There is some maple. The front can be made of spruce, and there are a variety of different woods. I'm sure that I'm leaving out. Of course, I'm not a professional luthier, of course, but yeah, you can make violins with different sorts of woods, but that's just part of the equation. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, is the design of the violin, like a Stradivari model or a Guarneri model. Apply the same kind of wood to Stradivari model versus the same wood versus a Guarneri model that luthiers make can sound drastically different. And it all depends on how much moisture there was in the air. You could also go back and research, and many scholars about Stradivari violins have argued that because Stradivari was born and raised in Cremona, Italy, that the wood back then, over 300 years ago, had a certain quality to them that is difficult to replicate these days. So, of course, that's just one piece of the puzzle in terms of the wood.
So I suppose that the violin made of Lego would probably sound great in an orchestra.
I would say no,
Oh, okay.
because it all comes down to physics with sound. And when you have a violin made of wood, you need to understand that wood also has pores and has the ability to vibrate. So depending on how thin the wood is, depending on the actual the ratios of the violin, of course, based on the Fibonacci sequence, the golden ratio, that's what violin and sound is made of, right? So you complement those and try to make a Lego violin. Plastic doesn't really vibrate that well, and also just the pure heaviness of the Lego probably wouldn't it
Yeah.
wouldn't do well, of course.
So talking about the type of wood and the heaviness of it, so I want to learn the violin. What kind of violin would you recommend?
Well, first and foremost, it depends on what age you are starting. So if you're if you're a parent, I recommend going to your local violin shop and off like do a rental just to see if your child would, gain interest in learning the violin. And then once you feel like she can, learn violin, then, you start renting it for a while and then you start purchasing it. And to pinpoint like a specific violin to purchase would be quite difficult for me because there's so much out there. My one advice for parents is just not get a violin on eBay. That's my one advice. And for any adult learner also thinking that they can learn the violin, buy a violin on eBay, believe me, it is way more difficult to get a violin on eBay and then actually make sounds on it because who knows how long that violin's been sitting in someone's basement and not been taken care of. Because if a violin is not played on often, then the sound is actually not that good. So you want to make sure that you go to a local string shop for you to get, professional advice, because many times these local shops, the people working in the front desk are violinists or musicians or instrumentalists working in the same field. And now I want to be clear to go to a local string shop and not your general music store, because if you go to a general music store, you're going to have someone who kind of does a little bit of everything, but not one thing well. So having a string like a luthier shop or like a strings shop will be really, really beneficial for you. And also the learning curve shortens in terms of learning the violin because you have the right equipment to help you get started.
We have a place called Long McQuaid down here, and they sell violins. And people who work there also they play guitar and piano and whatever they play, even singers. If you want to get instruction from them, you would go. You wouldn't go to a pianist if you want to learn the violin. You wouldn't go to
Of course,
uh,
yeah.
a drummer if you want to learn how to sing. But you can do all that at the same time as well, like Phil Collins and stuff. Um, but the violin. Sorry, my main question is the violin that I get. Is it just the violin in the case, or does it come with the accessories as well, like the headrest, extra strings, or rosin?
Yeah. So in my experience in local string shops, that when you get a rental, you get a bow and a violin, and usually get the chin rest on the violin, but you don't get a shoulder rest, and that's an extra add-on in my experience. Rosin usually comes with because it's like a tiny little square kick of rosin, so you don't have nothing to worry about there. People, go to like a music school that has violin teachers in them, and then they sign up for like trial lessons. This is pretty common. This is not like an industry secret. This is pretty common to have trial lessons at a music school to see if it's a right fit with the teacher and if I right fit with the school. That you are able to, get professional opinions that way. It's like, okay, I'm interested in learning the violin. First lesson may not have a violin involved, but you have a conversation with the teacher who you're paying for violin lessons, and they can, you know, provide their expertise. They may know a little bit more about, who to go to, who not to go to, who to trust, who not to trust. Make sure you're not getting ripped off or someone's overcharging you, because many times, people can get overcharged if they're not careful. So you want to make sure you go to a reliable shop, and usually teachers know where to go.
Yeah, I noticed that you played recently with Grammy Award winning Vijay Prakash, and you also had Aditya Rug. Oh, I guess Aditya is your mom, right?
Actually, Aditya Mrugala is my aunt.
Your
So
aunt. Oh,
yeah,
okay.
my aunt was my violin teacher for close to 11 years before I moved to Massachusetts for my collegiate studies. So that oftentimes that's not the case. Usually you don't have a family member giving violin lessons for you. But I had the great privilege to spend time with my aunt in that way.
Well, that's excellent. Yeah, and violin maker Douglas Cox as well. Wow.
Yeah, so Douglas Cox, again, a very renowned violin maker, violin luthier in Brattleboro. His violins are around the world, and I'm just grateful to be able to play on his instrument.
So when you play with someone, like let's say you were able to play with Pinchas Zukerman or Itzhak Perlman or Isaac Stern, even Andre Rieu, not only is he a conductor, but he's also a famous violinist as well. Um, when you get to play with these extraordinary, talented musicians, how does it make you feel? Like, do you feel that, oh, I didn't realize, like, could you play as well as them usually? Like,
Well,
what
I
do you?
feel like, yeah, that's a great question. And that's something that is not often talked about. If I, for instance, try to be like Yo Yo Ma, or if I try to be like Itzhak Perlman, then I will 100% fail because I'm not like them. But with these performances, I find that it's always a learning experience for me. It's never so much I'm not cringing in the corner like, oh my gosh, I gotta go practice. I'm not that good of a violinist. I never think that way. Like with the performance with Vijay Prakash, that performance was, not too long ago, and it was just like inspiring. I'm like, that's something that I've never done before to be able to perform Bollywood music with, a Grammy Award winning artists and musicians from Mumbai. I think that's what's so powerful about music is that you're able to learn different cultures on the job, and you're also learning to be flexible and try to figure out how to make a good performance work when you may not speak the same language, and that's a challenge in of itself. But going back to like, being as good as Itzhak Perlman or being as good as Pinchas Zukerman, that never really has come across my mind. And I'm definitely not as good as them. They're legends. They're amazing people. But you'll find that there are some really great violinists that I'm talking to on the Violin podcast that are my age, maybe even younger, who are doing really incredible things on the violin too. So everyone is doing something that helps, create the music industry like a better place. And yeah, I think it's an interesting conversation. It's an interesting thought to have.
What's your creative process like when you write your own compositions? How do you go about doing that?
Personally, I don't really compose all that much. Um, if I were to maybe collaborate with a composer, then we talk about how long a piece can be, what is the style, if does it want to have a particular message, does it want to be programmatic, does it not want to be programmatic, and for your audience who doesn't know what a programmatic piece of music is, it's a piece of music that has some kind of story or some kind of narrative behind it. This is something that back in music history, Richard Wagner and Johannes Brahms, they butted heads on this all the time because there's a difference between absolute music and programmatic music. Programmatic music, of course, as I just mentioned, but absolute music, you just take the music face value and you interpret it and you kind of think of it however you want it, and doesn't really have a narrative to it. Wagner, Hector Berlioz is known for this, for Symphonie Fantastique. Highly recommend that piece and those movements. But yeah, for me, it's also very difficult to find time to compose because you need to kind of, it's like a spare in the moment kind of thing. If I have an idea, then I try to write it down. But it's, for me, it's not a process that I'm involved with all that much.
Well, being a violinist, as long as you have, is it easy to detect a mistake through somebody else's playing? Like, what did you just do there? Oh, I think you did the wrong key there. Um, how successful would that actually be?
As a violinist, I try to be careful to judge my colleagues because I don't think judging anyone really does anyone any good. I just commend them for going on stage and just performing. And Beethoven said that, like it doesn't matter if you make a mistake as long as you play with passion. Of course, I'm paraphrasing his famous quote, of course, but for me, just to be able to watch people on stage and support my colleagues, that is that is the most important thing that I want to, have the audience really listen to. And as a teacher, of course, I will hear, the mistakes or the great things in my students do, but I don't go right after the performance and, bash on them with the mistakes that they did after coming off the stage. That's not who I am, and that's not how I really teach, because we always have to remember why we're doing what we're doing. And because of the age of competitions, it's very easy to kind of go in that direction, to watch mistakes and to be completely analytical, but it's not really healthy for you, because you're the one who's doing all the analyzing, while the person on the other side doing the performing is actually doing it. So I commend all my colleagues being able to be brave and to be able to perform at such a high level. And if they make a mistake, it's like, we've all been there. I know I've never performed a perfect performance, and I know that people who are listening to this podcast probably haven't either.
What is it about playing with Bijan Mortazavi, the Iranian violinist? What was it about his playing that you liked so much?
Oh man, that takes me back, Chris. That takes me back. I remember I was performing that performance with a bunch of colleagues from the Berklee College of Music, and the concert was at the Berklee Performance Center. And I remember this was the first time where I saw the audience just like get up and start dancing. For a classical musician, that's normally not the case. You just sit in your chair, you don't applause in between movements, you applause at the end. That's kind of like the culture around classical music. But for me, performing Bijan Mortazavi's concert, that was an experience in and of itself, because you have the Iranian community. Because for those of you who don't know, Bijan Mortazavi is like this Iranian pop violinist, singer, and he was in Boston many years ago for a concert, and I was involved with that. But you have families with their babies, just like holding their babies everywhere, dancing. It was the most incredible thing. And something that has that's clear in my mind right now, looking and remembering this performance, is that how much of a showman he was. He was able to interact with the crowd. He was able to do all the flashy showman kind of things, and that's what I took out of that performance. That he was a showman, and he was able to interact with an audience that I've haven't really experienced on stage before. And all the musicians on stage were dancing, we're having a good time, and that was actually in between my bachelor's and my master's, and that was one of the moments where I'm like, wow, this is actually kind of cool. Maybe I should branch out a little bit with the diversity part of my music career. And that's what really kept me going, these different performances.
Who is your dream duet partner? Who would you
Well,
like to play with?
who would I like to play with? Well, of course, my dream duet is my wife. I've always played music with my wife whenever I can. She's a pianist. But if there's one person in the professional world who I would like to collaborate with, I would like to collaborate with Timothy Choi, because Timothy Choi is a fantastic violinist. I've had the privilege of having him on the Violin podcast, and he is one of the violinists who I believe is just having such an amazing violin career. He's won 3 competitions, or at least, I think he won first in all 3 that he did. He did like Queen Elizabeth, and just incredible violinist, but also just like a down-to-earth human being. So I want to surround myself with like-minded people who are good at what they do at a very high level at their craft, but also just like genuinely nice people. And that's who I envision, or who I would want to play with in the future. If it's like even for a local concert that I can invite him, if he has like a slither of time in his busy schedule, that would be really amazing.
Apart from wanting to duet and collaborate with your wife and collaborate with others out there, is there anybody in the Violin podcast ever have any connections with them after?
Sometimes I do, but mostly I try to invite people on my podcast that is, you know, doing amazing things in the world with music, and the way they do it is through the violin, and that's what I talk about with them. And if the stars are aligned and the moment happens to be able to collaborate, then absolutely, then that is, then that happens. But that is my that is my ideology when I invite people on the violin podcast. I try to take a look at not their playing itself, but I try to take a look at, oh, how much value have they provided through the music world, and how have they changed people's lives. And that for me is the whole essence of why we play music, is to inspire and to change lives. So even though, like, yes, it would be great to perform, that's like not like the main reason why I invite people on the podcast.
That's a very interesting answer. Um, Excellent YouTube channel that you have. So what is this about the, like, I see a violinist playing and the horsehair on their bow goes all over the place, and they're playing with like two or four, maybe two or three leftover hairs. Like, I've literally seen it. A guy was playing the violin, and all the horsehairs all over the place. Like, it just, why don't you just get a new bow? Why are you playing it like that?
It could be aesthetic, depending on the genre of the music. If you're more classical violinist, then it's kind of customary to get a rehair, because you're like, what the heck are you doing? Get a rehair at this point. But like many rock violinists or many contemporary pop, like string quartets, sometimes that's like the style for them. And I can think of one Mexican violinist that actually does that. And it's just like the style. It's like the kind of like the rock style, like the bow hair going everywhere. Actually, Bijan Murtazavi actually did a little bit of that. And he also put like a lot of rosin on the violin bow, so that way when he does something crazy on the violin, there's like an evaporate, like, something like magicians would do, like have like this rosin that would be floating up in the air. And um yeah, so that I hope that answers your question in terms of the bow rehair. I mean, for me, I usually rehair my bows, because that's like the best course of action. I know that I'm going to get the best sound out of that, but to each their own.
Where do they get the horsehair from? Like, do they literally just cut it off the horse, or how does that come to be? Do you have an answer to that?
I know that for the bow hairs that I get, usually it's Mongolian horsehair. Usually they get that shipped from Mongolia, because they're hundreds and hundreds of horses there, and they get the highest quality horsehair over there. That's, in my view, the highest quality, and that's something that I've personally used. I haven't tried anything else, to be honest. I just go based on whatever the luthier or the bow maker or the bow rehairer has in stock, and I usually trust their judgment and what kind of hair they get.
They don't hurt the horses just to get them, do they? Or
No, I don't believe so.
that's very interesting, because I always wondered about that. But why horsehair when I just try to get like a synthetic, like one that isn't actually from a horse? Is that possible, or doesn't it give the same sound?
Well, there was an article many, many years ago having like a spider silk used as horsehair, and you could
Oh,
actually have some. There are actually some vegan options available for someone who is an instrumentalist but practice veganism. I know
hmm.
that they are, synthetic hair violin bows out there, so it's not like you have to go straight into having like horsehair from a horse. Of course, horses are not injured during the process, but because they're vegan, and nothing against veganism, it's just that's just their own stance. And I've seen my colleagues do that as well. I haven't personally tried vegan horsehair, so I think that'd be another interesting experiment on my YouTube channel.
I saw a really interesting movie the other day, Netflix, called My Father's Violin. The English subtitles. It's really good, and I really enjoy uh, violinists, and I really enjoy the music. And I really appreciate that you joined us here today on the stage. Thank you very much. But I see all your accolades here and all the your past engagements and collaborations. Wow. So where do you go from here?
I always try to go for the next performance, wherever that leads me. So I'm really grateful to have a great network of musicians and violinists who are able to continue provide performance opportunities for me. But that also includes performing at a high level to be able to get these performances back. And sometimes, if you're not in a regional orchestra, which I used to be, but I'm not anymore, just because of the scheduling conflicts that is associated with my teaching nowadays. Whenever I get a chance to perform, it's always a privilege. And for me, I always try to make every performance as good as if it was my last, because life can be so unpredictable at times. Sometimes you can get injured. Sometimes you could have a broken finger. There are so many things that can happen in your life. That just the fact that you're able to play music on stage at a high level with other musicians, that's a gift for me. And I envision continuing to work on the Violin podcast, create valuable content for my audience on YouTube, and create valuable violin concerts or anything that can help my community, whether it's online or in person.
So you're talking about life could happen. How did the pandemic affect you?
Well, first of all, I know that the pandemic has created like a huge shift amongst musicians to go from in-person performances, teaching engagements, and other things to everything online. And that adjustment had to be really quite quick, but I'm grateful to have this knowledge of technology where the shift wasn't so overwhelming for me. I know that many musicians who are not technologically savvy or didn't have the right equipment to transition for online, that was that was hard for a lot of people. And I know that in the beginning there was a level of uncertainty in the music world, just like, where do we go from here, right? Where do we go? All of a sudden our career kind of evaporated by night. No more performances, no nothing. And back when the pandemic was like really fresh in March of 2020, there was an article that was released that I read. Can't remember who the author is, unfortunately, but this person said that as musicians, we have to be prepared to kind of, this is not just like a 3 month or 6 month bend the curve thing. This is more so like we have to be ready for the next 18 months. And I think he was absolutely correct in making that statement, because because we had different waves around the world, people getting COVID, people not getting COVID, the vaccines, were not readily available. So I feel like a lot of it was dependent on that. But for me, with the transition, I'm grateful to have a full studio of violin students. So in terms of my income, it really didn't change all that much. But I know that a lot of musicians really struggled. But now I feel like everything is back to normal. We went through that rough patch. And I think this is a lesson learned for all of us as musicians, to not just put all our eggs in one basket and not just rely on just performance. You would be the smart one by kind of like diversifying your portfolio in terms of your musical engagement. Sometimes you teach, sometimes you do YouTube, sometimes you podcast, sometimes you do like a little bit of this and a little bit of that. So if there's any like advice that I were to give for any musician listening, it is just have have many diverse options available to you, so that way you're not just sticking to one thing, because that one thing can evaporate overnight.
Excellent, my friend. I like that answer. So apart from that, I shall connect with you later and hope that you have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Thanks, Eric.
Have a good
Bye.
one. Bye bye.